So today we have a very special guest here with us, John Wood from U.S. Wellness Meats. Primal, Palate, and U.S. Wellness Meats go way back many years. We had the great opportunity to visit their farms in northeast Missouri in 2012, and we had a great time touring the various farms and seeing the operations that they do to bring these super high quality meats to you, shipped wherever you want in the U.S. And we're just so impressed with the things that U.S. Wellness Meats has done in the past and continues to do, as they're a pioneer in the field of getting pasture raised, healthy meats direct to your door. So welcome, John Wood, and thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us today.
Well, Bill and Haley, honored to be a part of your mission, and a great thank you for all you do, because you help. You're a key integral part of the process in educating U.S. consumers. We started this thing in 2000. We were way ahead of the curve, and it's folks like yourself who were pioneers in the educational phase of this thing with your outstanding talents in cooking and recipes and some great publications and blogs, and it's just all part of the educational process. But it's really fun because, we just attended the Paleo FX in Austin 2 weeks ago, and it was, 3,500 people there, more than double last year. And I think you need to be applauded for your efforts, because you're all part of the leading the wave on this thing. But it's pretty exciting to see all those folks out, and a lot of people came by and been long-term customers. We got to put faces with names, and that air was really full of enthusiasm. It almost crackled, from the quality speakers we had on site out there, and it was just an awesome deal. I think the folks that put that together need to be credited as well, and everybody that was there was enthusiastic about next year. And my forecast is 5,000 people in 2017. Wow. So we'll see what happens.
Wow, that would be crazy. So you've basically identified, and maybe it sort of came to you from the stars or whatever, but you were doing this thing for paleo people before paleo was a thing. So tell us about how this came to be and U.S. Wellness Meats came to be.
Well, it's an interesting story. I guess where I kind of got off the track was in 1993. I was given Holistic Resource Management by Alan Savory to read, one of my, in fact, business partners now, one of the owners of the company. The cattle feeding industry was being controlled by the meat packers. The competition was not what it should be, and we were looking for alternative ways to utilize our land and resources. And along the way, we read about Dr. Mike Pariza, the grad student at the University of Wisconsin, who was doing research on charcoal broiling beef. Back in the 70s, there was a concern in the early 80s that charcoal was going to cause cancer, cooking meat over a charcoal flame. But much to everyone's surprise, Dr. Pariza discovered there was something in red meat that was impeding the growth of tumors. And our original light bulb moment, a couple of light bulb moments. Number one was the fact that, meat could be medicine, could be really, really healthy from the grazing animal. And then if you roll back the clock to 1995, the internet, became a viable option for marketing. And I guess my thought process was somewhere in the 90s was the closer we get to the consumer, the better we can control the product. And it was kind of a win-win for everybody. But that was, then the other watershed moment occurred in 1997. We actually produced and harvested the very first grass-fed animal, cherry-picked, was a Charolais Angus cross steer. Mr. Kenneth Suter, who's also a member of the company, was on his farm, and took it off to the country locker. And I told the told the locker manager, I said, I'm not sure this is fit for steaks. It was just against everything I've been taught to do. No starch in the diet, just high-quality forages. And much to our shock and surprise, we compared it to a piece of prime Hereford beef. It was just really prime plus. It was the best of the best. And we all three said the flavor was better on the grass-fed animal. And we cut everything with a plastic knife and a fork, and being from the Missouri Show Me State, we just didn't believe it. We had to see it again.
Wow.
And what we didn't realize, and what Mark Schatzker, who wrote the book Steak, New York Times bestseller about 7 or 8 years ago, what we didn't know and what we've learned since then is that the photolipids produced from animals grazing green forage is where the taste comes from, and we had no idea that at the time. But in 1998, we did it again, and we had the same results, much to our surprise. In 1999, we harvested 6 animals and got a little bit wiser, and we actually sent tissues off to the University of Illinois and Iowa State to the land grants that actually could measure CLA and measure the fatty acids that are in red meat, and both labs came back with essentially the same numbers. We had a really good CLA content, conjugated linoleic acid, and CLA is a unique compound that fights cancer, fights diabetes, good for the circulatory. Assist the animal or the human to put on lean muscle and take off fat. Iowa State had done a study in the winter 99-2000, and they had fed pigs hydrogenated safflower oil, which is a synthetic version of CLA, and the pigs had 25% less back fat and 10% larger loin eyes, much to everyone's surprise. It wasn't economically feasible, but it just proved the point that what CLA would do. And so, believe it or not, we have figure fitness models. You know, the gals that do the one-arm push-ups and do the gymnastics, and they were buying 75% lean ground beef from us, which is completely contrary to any bodybuilder. They just think you lost your mind, but they were after the CLA. And I've talked to several of those gals over the phone over the years, and it was just magical. They were raving about the stuff. And then we got into strongmen and strongmen competitors, and it wasn't so much how strong they were after the first 60 days. It was their knees were better, hips were better. Well, the omega-3 ratio at 2-to-1 versus 20-to-1 compared to omega-6, that was a omega-6 to 3 ratio, and commodity products about 18 to 20-to-1, and then grass-fed beef at 2-to-1, chickens at 3-to-1. And so, once you improve that omega-6 3 ratio, it just magical things happen. And then one of the most amazing people we met in the last 2.5 years is Maureen Quinn, who's a young lady that lives out on Long Island and a microbiologist by day and a strongman. She calls herself a strongman competitor. I'm not going to argue with her. She's 118 pounds, and she's deadlifting over 300 pounds. And she helped us down at the Paleo FX in Austin. And every time I see her, I'm just amazed that she's that strong. It's just the most incredible thing I've ever seen. But she's gotten into the paleo movement in a great way, and she eats once a day. She says, John, remember, lions only eat once every 2 or 3 days. And she just see the steel in her eyes and the fire in her eyes. But nobody would suspect she's that strong. But she's a 75 to 80% fat diet, and eats between 530 and 630, and high fat, high protein diet. And it's just simply off the chart what she's capable of doing.
Wow, so she's fasting from 6:30 in the evening until 5:30 again the next day.
She fasts for 23 hours. She was here last summer in September. She competed in the Quad Cities, Davenport, Iowa, and it was a strongman competition, and she qualified for the World Championships, which were at the Arnold in Columbus in March. And she was a number 2 American woman. And of course, she'd never been on a farm before, and we gave her the same tour that you and Haley took, and she was just mesmerized by the animals. And we finished that. It was about 11:30. I said, "Are you hungry?" She says, "No, it's not really dinner time till 5:30." I kind of looked at her kind of funny, and I said, if someone that trains as hard as you do, you're really hungry? Oh, no, I just eat once a day. And that, of course, that started a whole other line of questions. But
wow.
But she's the most amazing person I've ever met. I mean, pound for pound, it's just. And you look at her hands. Her hands are just a small woman's hand, and I just don't see how she can hang on to 300 pounds. I won't pick it up. But unfortunately, she sprained her ankle 2 weeks before the competition, and she couldn't compete this year. But she and the girl that actually defeated her, I think, came in second. So she would have been right there at the right there at the top of the world, so to speak. But anyway, so then Nora Kadiopoulos, who wrote Primal Body, Primal Mind, they were at Ancestral Health together back in, I guess, December last year, and Nora really got a kick out of her because she's really the role model for what Nora talks about in her book as well. And she's pretty much self-taught. She's figured this thing out just through the paleo community.
Yeah, which has just grown so much in the last few years. It's really mind-blowing. One of the things that's so interesting, it struck me when we were out at your farm, and I think it's a really important part of what you're doing, is actually the land stewardship, aspect of raising the cattle the way they're supposed to be raised. Do you want to talk about that a little bit? Because I think that's just so important.
Well, that's probably the most exciting thing that we've stumbled into in the last 4 or 5 years. I belong to the grassfedexchange.com, which is a group of producer group, and we meet once a year. We've just had the 7th annual meeting in Perry, Georgia back in April. Probably 400 of us got together from around the country, all interested in producing beef. But one of the real avenues we really pursued in the last 4 or 5 years is soil health, soil biology, and Gabe Brown was a member of the committee for the last 3.5 years. He's kind of the rock star. He's been interviewed by Dr. Mercola, and he's probably one of the shrewdest farmers in the United States. He's got a large grazing and crop operation in North Dakota. He's used no commercial fertilizers for the last 7 years. And the one that just blows people's minds, Bismarck, North Dakota gets cold. Normally the frost goes down 5 to 6 feet deep. All the water lines up there are 6 feet or deeper. Wow. And he says in the wintertime, his soil biology is so active with the actinomycetes and the mycorrhiza fungi and the earthworms. And all he does to create that wealth of soil carbon is he has frost not much deeper than 6 inches, which is just absolutely off the chart.
Wow.
And so, you've got Doug Peterson in Missouri, you've got Abe Collins from Vermont, and these guys are actually in the top 5% in the entire country when it comes to understanding how these models work. But this year on the farm, we planted a cover crop mix. There's 8 different species. There's legumes, there's grasses, there's summer annual forages. It's about 15 inches high right now. We're still probably 30 days away from grazing it. But you just have all these different plant species, and we're trying to get away from monocultures. Mm-hmm. And I was through the pastures over the weekend, and I'm just stunned by how much clover I have, which is part of the diversity of the mix. And the prairie grasses are coming back, and of course the grazing management. What we're doing, it's just like if you can picture the room you're sitting in or standing in at the moment, and you broke it up in 30 different squares, and the animals are in square one on day one, and you go around 30 days later. Well, you can imagine what your yard would look like after 30 days of rest, and we continually try to work on at least 30 days of rest, and every year you do that, the roots go deeper. And the livestock actually are part of the healing of the soil, and we're creating lots of carbon. Abe Collins is probably one of the top gurus in the world on creating carbon. He's done some neat things in northern Vermont, a very difficult soil up there, and he's created 6 or 7 inches of pure humus in about 3 or 4 years. Cornell University is just kind of shocked at what he was able to do. But mycorrhiza fungi are a fungi that actually they attach to the roots of any kind of a plant, and carbon is in the atmosphere, and they're able to extract carbon from the atmosphere through the plant system, and the mycorrhiza fungi actually bind that carbon to the soil. And there's companies out there now that are actually, you can buy mycorrhiza fungi, and you have to, you can actually apply that to the soil and actually kind of seed the soil with that. But mycorrhiza fungi, and that gets back to Alan Savory, the carbon thing in the planet. It's pretty simple. You bring the grasslands back to where they were, 1,000 years ago, and you solve the carbon problem. That's just basically you can turn deserts back into grasslands, and the Great Plains of the United States and areas in Mexico and Arizona, and Las Vegas, Nevada. The reason the Union Pacific put the railroad station in Las Vegas because of all the artesian wells. There was free-flowing water there back in the 1800s. It rained 4 inches a year in Las Vegas. 90% of it went in the ground, and 10% ran off. And now, it rains 4 inches a year, and 90% of it runs off, and 10% of it soaks in, just because we were on the soil surface with too many cattle and then too many sheep, and we created the deserts. So, sure. And there's a way to correct that action, and that's I hope I live long enough to see areas that are brought back to original life. There's paintings and there's pictures taken in the 1800s in parts of Arizona. There's horses, men on horseback, and the grass up to the stirrups of horses. And today it's nothing but just desert. And we, as a country, we really screwed up in the 1800s. We didn't know what we were doing and went out there and overgrazed. But there's some smart folks now that know how to correct that. And there's actually some pretty interesting pockets of money that are quite enthused. We've had a group that actually put scholarships up for young farmers and young ranchers to attend the grass-fed exchange. And there's hedge funds that realize that agriculture is an exciting place to actually do some neat things. And a couple of members of the grass-fed exchange are working on a couple of pretty noble projects, trying to turn some of these landscapes around. So I think the next 10 years is going to be pretty exciting.
That's awesome. I had no idea that those parts of the West were grasslands before, but it makes total sense that the ecosystem would be pretty different from, sort of, I'll call it pre-civilization, even though, to be fair, I'm sure there was some form of civilization there that didn't screw it up before.
Well, but basically, if you look at the Plains Indians, they were great land managers. I mean, I forget, I think there were like 2 million bison in North America, back in the late 1700s, and these huge herds of bison would roam, not counties, but states. They would go from North Dakota to Texas and back up again in the summertime. Made these huge, hikes, and they would stop for 2 days and graze and come back a year or two later, and it was just the perfect ecosystem. And Oklahoma, in the 1800s, when they went out and did the Oklahoma land rush, they were breaking the prairie sod out there, and the soil humus and soil health was just, on a scale of 1 to 10 was perfect. Yeah. And then after they broke the sod and killed the sod, and then they had soil erosion and then wind erosion. But it's somewhat amazing. Gabe Brown has got some organic matters up over 10%, outside of Bismarck, North Dakota, which is just. Every inch of every 1% organic matter, you can store like an extra 2 inches of water. So he can have an 8-inch rain on his fields, and it all soaks in. And his neighbor, 90% of it runs off. It's just, and we know how to do this. And you go to the Acres meeting every year. Acres is a farm press. It's a farm magazine with some really great innovators, and there's enough people around now. And actually, the Soil Conservation Service, has finally accepted the fact that there's some folks out here doing some really neat things, and now there's some cost share. In fact, Dave Collins has actually been on a national level and lobbied in Congress, to create, some opportunities for some of the USDA monies to be spent in a different direction. It's a pretty simple solution, but we need to get together, and we need to do it now, because Iowa, for example, I live on the Mississippi River, and if you look up and study the flood history since 2000, 8 out of the top, or 7 out of the highest river crests in the history of the Mississippi River, going back to the 1800s, have occurred since 2000. For God's sake, it's just the fact that Iowa, we plowed up the pastures, and the organic matter has dropped, and soil erodes a lot easier, and water runs off. And it's the same thing in Illinois, and the same thing in Minnesota. And huge swaths of South Dakota, North Dakota, that used to be grasslands, are now being farms. So it's, the trend is not good, but there's enough people now that recognize the problem. I'm optimistic that, that we can actually start doing some neat things.
Yeah, it sounds like the 100-year floods have now become the 2 or 5 year floods.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Since 1993, it's just the highest flood ever recorded where I live in Canton, Missouri, was 1993, and then 2008 we got within 1 or 2 inches of it, and we've had some huge rises in the river, and it's just the same one. But it doesn't take a rocket scientist to look at what's going on there to see what's actually taking effect. It's like 20 million acres of grassland has been converted to cropland in the last 15 or 20 years. You look at the crop basis in commercial agriculture, wonder where all the acres came from. Well, it's all pasture land that's been turned over. But I think there's some smart people now that recognize the problem, and we're trying to do something about it. But if you study the Navajo Indians and talk to some of the older Navajos, I mean, people like Alan Savory have interviewed. This is 10 or 15 years ago in Arizona, and the people that were in their 80s and 90s talked about what it was like when they were children. This has all happened in the last 80 to 90 years. I mean, there was some tremendous. And you take Google Earth and look down into Mexico, and you can see where the watersheds were, and it was basically a sea of grass until we messed it up. But there's like I said, like if you go to northern Africa, there were no deserts there until the last 20,000 years. I mean, before that, there was Iraq was that was the breadbasket.
Right.
And there was 50 inches of rainfall a year, and it occurred in 3 months, and 9 months are dry. Well, if you read Savory, basically before man got involved, there was grazing herds of herbivores, and they were chased around by tigers and leopards and cheetahs, and they all grazed in a bunch. They were managed grazers, and they moved every day and for their own protection. And then man came along and got rid of the predators, and pretty soon there was overgrazed and undergrazed. And it's just like going to a smorgasbord. If you took your 10 best friends into Pittsburgh and you visited a smorgasbord, and the owner only replaced what you ate the day before, pretty soon there's a lot of that food you don't want. And that's the way animals are in an open stock grazing situation. I sat there and watched that for 25 years. I didn't know what was going on. And in our pastures where we just turned animals loose for the season, there were areas where it was grazed like a lawn, and there were areas where it was up over your knees. And I couldn't figure out why. Well, cattle aren't stupid. They'll graze off an area. And of course, the most tender grass is is the regrowth. And so it was just a very poor use of the landscape. Managed grazing, they go in and lawn mow off an acre or two at a time, and then you let that rest for 30 days. Then the neat thing is you have twice as much forage 3 or 4 years later.
It's really interesting. In a similar but also different way, I don't know if I mentioned this, but we got chickens last year. And, we're on like a little 1/4 acre plot in suburbia, which is, that's a conversation for a different time. But it's just been really interesting because we have them in a run, and chickens do the thing where they scratch with their legs and look for bugs and stuff, and they can take down. I think we've probably got them in 250 square feet, and they can mow that down in about a week. So we do this thing in the warmer months when we have the fresh grass, and we move their run from place to place so that they can have fresh grass. And we've already been through one full season with them. And the area that's downslope of the chickens has the greenest grass you've ever seen in your life, because chicken manure is so nitrogen rich, and grass loves nitrogen. So, in sort of a small, similar way, you can see that if you have these animals that are producing these nutrient, rich, manures on the land, they can really improve the quality of the soil, and it's just amazing to see.
No, and chickens are probably the very best example, because you've got you can have 40 or 50 chickens in a 10 by 10 or 12 by 12 or 14 by 14 pen, and so you're just saturating, and they're eating everything. They're eating the bugs to get their protein, and then they're leaving that beautiful chicken litter behind them. And it's just, I've seen farmers, where they put these cages out in their paddocks, and you can sure tell where the chickens were, because it's just brilliant green strip of grass wherever they were, where they made their travels. But that's a very effective way. It's a great, chickens are a great introductory for young people and wanting to get involved in production agriculture. And, it doesn't take a lot of capital to get involved in the chicken business. And I encourage young people, it's a great thing for families to have, and kids learn some responsibility. It doesn't take a small fortune to play. And once you kind of figure out the chickens, you you get involved with lambs or goats, and they're not hugely capital intensive, and it takes a certain amount of money to be in the livestock or in the cattle business. I mean, those animals' first costs are much higher. But the beauty of the chickens, and the beauty of the rabbits, and those sort of things, you can do it on. It's an entry form for interested folks to become involved in agriculture. And there's some great stories of people with no farm backgrounds. There's a TED Talk, and I can't rattle the guy's name off, but he's a beginning farmer and an ex-military. And I think he started this thing in the state of Washington. And he was just wildly successful. He was producing broilers, and people loved the chickens, and he expanded, and pretty soon he had a full-time business. So it's just, it doesn't take and there's so many people know how to do this. I mean, you can go read the Joel Salatin books, and Joel's made a lifetime out of educating people. So, but the chicken thing is a great way to get started.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's shift gears a little bit. We talked a little bit about the early days of U.S. Wellness Meats, and we talked about, sort of the land stewardship aspect. What have you seen in like the last 5 years, and what do you see coming in the next 5 years that's been really exciting and is sort of on your mind about this whole thing?
Well, the last 5 years, basically, it's been, the acceptance, of the practice that we were doing for the first 10 years. The first 10 years we were so far ahead of the curve, and in the last 5 years, we finally got into what I call critical mass. The consumers, about 2006 or 7, I think, is when we realized, we were really kind of on the right track. For the first 6 or 7 years, it was always a question, will we ever have enough demand to make this a realistic, opportunity? And the last 5 years, the demand has really picked up. And the other enthusiastic thing to see is there's a lot of people, doing what we did. I mean, it's you got a few pioneers that take the arrows, and there's a lot. You go online and Google up grass-fed beef, you're going to find scores of people that are doing this in various methods. Some of them are farmers markets, some of them are producing 4 or 5 animals a year. But you have critical mass, and then in the grass-fed exchange, the beauty of that is a number of producers that show up to these events, and we try to have them in different parts of the country. And in September of 2017, it's going to be Albany, New York. That'll be a whole different area of the United States. And we've got a couple of well-known chefs from New York City that are going to kind of showcase that from the consumer perspective. But it's becoming accepted. And the other watermark, I guess, which I didn't really like to see, but you've got Cargill and JBS, the 2 of the largest meat companies in the world, have finally accepted that this is for real. And once we kind of got to 5% market share, they waded into the ring and throwing their marketing muscle around. So you can go into some major retailers today and see some of their products in the meat case. But we still go back to know your food, know your farmer, and we think that the small farm is really where you're going to get your best value and know who you're dealing with. And so that's one of the things that's been a major landscape change was about in the last 2 years we finally hit 5% market penetration, and then all of a sudden, that's kind of the magic threshold for the large players. They realized that they were for real. And a couple of land-grant universities have published some articles that were negative, which was kind of a positive sign for us. We had a couple of, really bright PhDs and medical doctors that were quite amused because they could just pick apart some of the logic that they were being used. And so, it's, there's the grain-fed industry has realized that we're taking a piece of their market away. But and for the next 5 years, I see continued growth. I think the paleo movement's one of the rising stars. We've been feeding the New York Jets for the last 6 or 7 years, and the trainer sees fewer injuries and quicker recoveries, and we have athletes on pro baseball teams and pro football teams that are customers, and so. It's just kind of all walks of life. You've obviously got, our original model was soccer moms trying to do the best for their children and understood what was going on, people like yourself. And then you have senior citizens that realize the omega-3 benefits and trying to slow the aging process down. And then sadly, you have the folks with out and try to get the cleanest form of meat you can. And so we deal with a number of folks in that particular category. category. And so, but the beauty of it is we really appeal to all walks of life. If you like a good tasting steak, my son did a taste test Sunday night with some esteemed cattlemen in western Missouri, and they were cooking up grass-fed beef against some of the best grain-fed beef, and it was a tie. I mean, there was a surprised look on the faces of several of these folks that are highly respected in the cattle feeding industry, and they were, I think, probably shocked at the fact that the grass-fed was tender and it had great flavor. And so, the product's going to eat good, it's going to taste good, and that's one of the challenges. That's one of the reasons the grass-fed exchange is formed, to try to get folks to realize how important it is. Once you harvest the animal, the meat has to be taken care of properly, it has to be aged properly, and there's a number of things you have to do right even after you produce the animal to have a good eating experience. Sure.
Well, I think the future is just getting brighter and brighter for the food industry in general. People are looking to organic and grass fed, and you mentioned the competition of the bigger names, and I think that in general will hopefully lead to some of these more positive environmental changes too, because that's good for everyone. So.
No, that's all part of the same marketing. I mean, and the one thing that's really changed in the last 5 years is the consuming public is starting to ask a lot more questions. I mean, we get literally interrogated every day by emails and phone calls about all the finer parts of what we do and why we do it, and ingredient labels, and the general public, it's just kind of like waking up a sleeping lion, so to speak, and they just don't take anything for granted anymore. And then, interestingly enough, you got the state of Vermont that's pushed the labeling button, food labeling button. All of a sudden, Trader Joe's now wants everything in their stores to be GMO free, antibiotic free, and so now some of the major players are trying to get ahead of that curve. So, it's been interesting to watch how this thing has unfolded, and but the public, I think realizes that they can have a say in the discussion, and it's we've always had the organic option, which was going to be GMO free and antibiotic free and all those fine points, but it looks like the retailers are starting to recognize that, people are serious about labels. If you're going to play in this market, you're going to have to be on that team as well. So I think, the Europeans have been ahead of us for 10 or 15 years, from the standpoint of food labels and what they accept and what they don't accept. And but I think the U.S. industry is seeing the handwriting on the wall that you're going to have to be much more clear and how you label products and how products are being handled by the public. But I think the consumer eventually is starting to have a change and have an effect. I mean, there's some decisions being made in corporate boardrooms as we talk here tonight that you wouldn't have thought possible 5 years ago.
Sure. Well, John, as always, thank you so much for taking all this time to talk to us. I mean, it's really interesting talking to you. You go to all these interesting conferences and really keep your finger on the pulse of the science behind animal husbandry, which is just obviously it's tantamount to what you're doing, but it's good for everybody who patronizes U.S. Wellness Meats too. So. Just great talking to you, and thank you so much for taking the time tonight to speak with us.
Well, thank you very much as well. I mean, Bill and Haley, you're part of the team, so to speak, too. I mean, the books you publish are just over the top, and the photography and the quality of presentation that you present, and obviously, it's always fun to see passionate people and with their heart and soul, completely into the mission at hand, and you certainly have earn our kudos for that, and we certainly appreciate all you've done to help promote the industry. And I always say good things happen to good people, and you're two of the best.
Oh, thank you so much.